Thank you so much. So first of all, really honored to be here, really delighted. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having all of us. Wonderful company to be in. So I'll just say a few things to get us on our way, and then I will stay out of the way. Our panel is talking about the challenge to freedom. And maybe I'll start with what those challenges are, and then I will raise 3 separate issues that I would like all of you to address. You'll have different perspectives and different answers will come of it. So I'll start with this. As far as challenges to freedom go, I just flew in from DC, and we often quote Reagan saying that freedom is never more than 1 generation away from extinction. I think this is uniquely a time when we all feel it. There is also something that I don't know if John knows, we often quote, that's John O'Sullivan's first law, that all organizations, if they're not actually right of center, sooner or later they're leftist. And as far as the challenges, maybe first let's deal with threats. We had a very strange year behind us. The governments grew over COVID. Cancel culture at the same time when we were all sequestered in our homes and not really communicating with one another, took on our culture, took on our civilization, and above all, took on our past and vilified it in a very unprecedented way, because with no reaction in the West, really. And so while power was centralized, is being centralized, individuals at the same time are being liberated, but they're being liberated by destroying the communities that are the only competition to that increasingly centralized power. And those communities are churches, religions, and of course nations. And in Europe, we all feel how much nation states are targeted by that liberation of individual. Right now at the level at which mothers are being liberated from their children, and the young liberated from the inconveniences of having the old among them, and it's actually getting pretty gruesome if you start calling a spade a spade. What's important though, and I think this is an important issue for us to sort out with Dr. Colm having spoken a moment ago, all of it is underwritten by somebody. Something pays for it. And we feel it very much in the United States that what pays for it is no less than woke capital that embraces those values and makes it very difficult to compete with them, precisely because of their very powerful means. They endorse culture war against the West, sexual revolution, gender fluidity. The weirder it is, the more likely they're going to pay for it, and actually create campaigns that directly target those who are used to things being more normal, more intuitive. And that takes us to the challenge of freedom, or the challenges to freedom. Nobody really comes in and says, I want to take your freedom away. I don't believe freedom is good. I don't think this is a viable political position. But what does happen is freedom is being redefined. And I think this is what we want to do here, is put the world back on its legs from its current position, it seems, on its head. Freedom and values on which, this is again something Dr. Colm addressed, it's not just reason. Our order is built on a set of virtues, on a set of values. We're much more than reasonable. We are called to be virtuous. The redefinition of our values puts them literally on their heads. Freedom is really now what licentiousness is called, so utter lack of self-restraint. Justice is increasingly beginning to look like envy and glorification of envy. And equality is driven by very powerful discrimination against anybody who in any way stands out or believes in anything. And this is where I'll go to questions to our wonderful panel. I would like each of you to answer all of them. And the first one is going to be, I would like Professor Legutko to start, and I would like to focus for a moment on the rhetoric of freedom. There is a lot of it. We're hearing a lot about freedom, about how free we are, how unprecedented that state of utter liberation is. And yet, it strangely seems that the use of words is completely inversely proportional to our sense of freedom. We have fathers in prison in Canada for using wrong pronouns, for insisting on wrong pronouns for their own children. We literally are being, the use of wrong pronouns is being criminalized, just to kind of put that in perspective. So the question that I would like Professor Legutko to start with, how free are you? Are we really that free? You wrote 2 books about it.
Thank you, Anna. Good morning. Yes, well, Proposition 1, freedom has been on the wane for quite some time. And Proposition number 2, we live in the world of the corrupted language, that is the mendacious language. And we are being told that ours is the freest society in the history of mankind. Now, this is obviously not true, but what is amazing, astonishing, is that a lot of people take it for granted, and they seem to be acquiescing to the situation as well as to the corrupted language. Well, let me give you an example, a rather typical example. A couple of months ago, a professor of sociology, I believe, from one of Polish universities, was criticized, disciplined, and then she resigned from the university from saying that family is based on a marriage between one man and one woman. And of course, you can give me dozens of similar examples, but I was struck by the fact that first it happened in my country. I mean, 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, it would have been unthinkable. I'm not talking about the bad old days. I'm talking about the recent period. I mean, it would have been unthinkable in the John Paul II country that you are being harassed by the university administration and that you have to leave because you say that a marriage is a union of one man and one woman. But even more surprising and more frustrating was that nobody, I mean, no academic organizations, associations stood in the defense of that lady. And I was just wondering why this reaction or no reaction at all. Of course, it's human weaknesses, cowardice. We know all the answers, but I think there was a certain rationale behind it, namely that they could not afford to defend her because they would have been disqualified themselves and rejected by the society, by the academic society, and I mean international society. I mean the university and the individual career of those people would have been threatened. I mean, we live in an internationalized world, and this world is more and more ruthless in enforcing the new ideology. It's not that you can find a place of refuge. There is nowhere to run now. I mean, of course, there are still some places, but fewer and fewer. And there are powerful institutions such as the European Union that, well, they have been considering themselves to be the watchdog and the guardian of this ideology, and they use all means possible and violating all possible rules, and precisely because our language has been corrupted, a lot of people are not aware of what is being done to them. I mean, they believe that it's because all the powers that be want to make the world free of discrimination, right? More equality. Well, this is what has to be done in order to have less discrimination and more equality. Whereas what is taking place is really scary. And as I said, the scariest part of it is that our minds have been manipulated, and we are no longer able, we lack the language to describe the situation. I mean, that's the most important thing, probably, to master the language with which you can describe what is happening just around you, right? Very in your in the world in which you live, because your mind has been fed with, you know, those cliches, these ideological keywords with a deformed meaning, and you are unable to describe what is going on. It's not only the academics. I mean, it's corporations and media and.
Maybe we will be going back to this. Sure. Maybe we can. Daniel, please.
Thank you so much. I would like to center what I would like to say on what's going on from the economic perspective and the monetary perspective, coming back to what Professor Cohn was saying. A key principle of freedom is responsibility. And one of the mistakes that we see in monetary policy and in economic policy is that we have gone from using extraordinary tools as something that helps to make to take measures for structural reforms, to using extraordinary tools like quantitative easing as a measure to avoid structural reforms. So instead of trying to incentivize responsibilities, we're incentivizing recklessness. The extraordinary level of monetary support and massive level of government spending also hinders freedom from the perspective of a reality that is often escaped from the mind of the average citizen, which is that monetary policy is never neutral, is that money creation is never neutral. It always massively benefits the first recipient of money, the indebted and governments, and it hugely, disproportionately, negatively affects real wages and the savers. Therefore, concepts like inequality that are often repeated are exacerbated by monetary policy. On top of it, we have another problem, is that the emergency policies that are implemented work as a tool to increase the size of government on the way in and on the way out. First, through massive deficit spending and monetization of that deficit. Second, through taxation. It's first, you increase the size of government via huge government spending in a period of crisis, and then via taxation, you increase the size of government by increasing taxes on the productive sectors, creating not just a crowding out effect, but a lack of competitiveness and, more important, a competition advantage for the public sector that is unprecedented. Today, as we speak, the government of Portugal is issuing 10-year bonds at 0.2%, the Spanish government at 0.3%. Who in this room would purchase those bonds if the central bank did not purchase them at these levels? Nobody. That's a bubble. Now, the question is, where would we start to think about purchasing those bonds without the central bank being not a lot, not a bit, not a lot, 100% of the net issuances of sovereign bonds. They buy everything, okay? Where would we have to start to think about purchasing those bonds? At 0.6, that's double. At 0.9, that's triple. At 1.3, that's 4 times. No, because inflation is at 2.5%, 3%. Okay, so think about this. Think about the massive, massive level of risk-taking that is happening at the public sector through the monetization of sovereign debt and the aggressive level of use of monetary policy. In a recovery, this is not the crisis. Crisis happened many months ago. Now, what I think is most important here to the impact on freedom is that we've gone from using government and central banks as the lender and provider of liquidity of last resort to being the lender and provider of liquidity of first resort, which is extremely dangerous. It is extremely dangerous because you create a policy for an emergency, then you create an emergency for a policy. And we need to defend sound money and responsibility precisely if we want the European Union to continue to be together. Because right now, as all bubbles, it looks like nothing has happened. The other day somebody was telling me it's been 6 years and nothing has happened. Well, 6 years is nothing. Means absolutely nothing. That's like saying in 2001 that the real estate bubble was not a problem. So ultimately, what we need to understand is that there is a threat to freedom from the policies that seem to try to solve the things that cannot be solved, like the closing of an economy by a government. It cannot be solved with more liquidity and more spending. It's ridiculous. A supply shock is not solved with demand-side policies. Makes absolutely no sense. And now we see inflation. So on top of taxation and government spending, we see inflation, taxation without legislation. Inflation, the tax on the poor. Huh? And the risk that I see is that the history of money always tells us the same thing. First, you say there's no inflation. Second, you say it's transitory. Third, you blame businesses. That's happening today. This is happening today all over Europe. It's happening here in Portugal, it's happening in Spain, it's happening in Italy. Fourth, you blame consumers. You overspend, you don't know what to buy, you don't know when to use the laundry machine. Fifth, price controls. And that's where we don't want to go. So all of us need to work together to understand that one thing is an extraordinary measure and a completely different thing is to make it not normal, but the common and the lender and provider of liquidity of first resort. Thank you so much.
All of it in the name of liberation of the individual.
I'm sorry?
All of it in the name of liberating the individual.
Can people hear this? No, you can? Okay, good, thank you. Well, first of all, this is too big a subject, really. There are so many aspects to it, and it's very hard to join up the dots. So I'll just pick and choose a few points. The first is to pick up what Richard said about the failure of the authorities, the university authorities and professional bodies to defend a woman who said something that is probably the view of 70% of the population, 80%. Now, he made the point, which is very true, impressively so, that how would this happen in Poland, the country of John Paul II? But we might be even more surprised to ask how it is that the refusal to accept, well, the suppression of free speech in universities and in public takes place in venues which were, are, and have been dominated by people of liberal mind since the Second World War. When I went to university in the 60s, the idea that the left-wing academics, and they were mainly left-wing then, would have suppressed speech, would have distorted it, would have marked a student down for disagreeing with him, would have been regarded by most of the liberal academics I knew with absolute horror. And the experience of students was quite common, that if they had conservative views, they might have a kind of mildly comic, antagonistic relationship with that professor who would direct questions to them. But then when they got their degrees and they went to him for a recommendation, he would give them a glowing recommendation. This was quite standard. It's what I would regard as the way that, in a sense, liberal arguments and liberal practices should be taken for granted. But of course, it's gradually ceased to be taken for granted. It's gradually been violated. And now, of course, the violation has become the principle by which academics act, or, as Richard, of course, pointed out, they are more or less forced to act. Because if they don't share the outlook of the students, of the politically woke their colleagues, they will find themselves, first of all, they won't get a job, and if they happen to have got a job, they won't stay in it long. Now, there is something very odd about this, because if you look at election results or opinion polls, you will discover, of course, that the attitudes which are now condemned and which are the basis for firing people in professional life, in corporations, in NGOs, in journalism, of course, particularly, those attitudes are the attitudes of the majority of the population to judge from election results. And so what has been created in a most interesting and alarming way, and I can't fully explain it, of course, and I can't fully suggest remedies to it, is the creation of a false public. We know what the public thinks. Well, at the moment, we're still allowed to from opinion polls, and that probably is distorted. We know what the public thinks on a range of issues, but what is accepted as public opinion, and particularly in areas of elite interest in academic life and elsewhere, is very often the opposite of that point of view, but it is nonetheless imposed. We know about these things because of the operation of the tabloid press. It is the tabloid press, not the responsible press, which by and large tells you of the scandals that result in all areas of life when somebody expresses a point of view and is then driven out from, so to speak, civilized conversation. And it is perfectly, and we know the reason for that. The reason that we have to rely very often on the tabloids is because newspapers like the New York Times are now governed, in effect, by Soviets of their junior staff who rebel against anything which the editors think is their responsibility as old-fashioned journalists to present to the public as a point of view which they may not share, but nonetheless they think is worthy of interest. Now, the classic case being that when a Republican senator wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that said that if necessary, military force should be used to prevent the destruction, looting, and violence that caused the loss, by the way, of 30 lives in the riots that took place across America in 2020. That was accepted, it was edited, it was due to appear, but then the junior staff protested and said that it was contrary to everything the New York Times stood for, that it should present the point of view of the majority, perhaps, but a different point of view to progressive ideology. Now, I can't quite understand how this happened. I can detect some reasons for it. namely that, of course, if for over a long period of time the rest of society did not take seriously the gradual replacement of promotion and advancement in academic life by merit, replacement of that by adherence to the view of which increasingly the kind of cultural Marxist view of the majority of academics. That itself took a certain amount of time to bring about, to create that false public. But once it had been created, then, of course, the rest sort of followed. And now we face a situation in which points of view that we hold, and the points of view with which we disagree, of a reasonable conservative kind, or of a reasonable liberal kind, or indeed of a reasonable left kind, those views cause people to become silenced and cancelled. I think that
perhaps this may be a good moment, because we're coming to the second question.
I better stop.
And actually the second question will first be addressed to you, and this is a really good place to make that transition, and you will actually be able, I think, to continue. All of what you're describing, this is, of course, Senator Tom Cotton, whose op-ed was solicited by the New York Times, so he didn't even call submit. It was solicited and then cost the editor his job. Everything you're describing is happening in the name of something. And that's, I mean, it's in the name of justice, social justice. And it is negotiated, it seems, not really in courts, but by Twitter mobs. And of course, the younger academics, the younger reporters, have the advantage of being on Twitter, very active, with a lot of followers, and many in their own newsrooms say that the headlines are nowadays written on Twitter. So social justice, trying to change the world for the better, is really our second question, because that is another value, another virtue, the pursuit of justice. You mentioned public good. That is my second question. Everything that you're describing, everything that all of you described, the economic impact, all of it is to accomplish a particular equitable outcome. The professor was hurting somebody, some people who couldn't speak up, who didn't quite fit the categories. I mean, all of it is supposed to make the world a better world. Just as Professor Legutko was saying that we're supposedly living in a more free world, we're also living in a more just world. John, this is something that you have, in a way, written about. You described 3 people and the way they came together to quite literally change the world and make it a more just world. You also talked about that what it took was the Pope, the President, of course, and the Prime Minister, but it took faith, it took courage, and it took something that I think you referred to in your book as unleashing that national virtue. And that, you're saying, produced a more just world. Do you see a way to harness what is happening right now to produce a more just world?
Well, I don't see any way of harnessing the social justice warriors. Yes. No, I don't. And in that way, I think I'll sort of be very brief here and just simply say, there is the hope for the future, it seems to me, as Orwell said, lies in the proles. They can't understand and don't like any of what's going on. They're closer to reality than most people. They see this as unfair, as vicious, as monstrous, and in a sense, we have to rely, those of us who believe in liberty, have to rely in this instance, it seems to me, on democracy, because we don't have many weapons in this battle, unfortunately, but one of the weapons we have is that majorities can be assembled on our side in electoral battle for the moment, because there is no doubt that the longer this goes on, the more people will become indoctrinated by it. Not everyone is successfully indoctrinated, but some are. And so, as I say, we have to seek some support for liberal ideas, traditional liberal ideas, conservative ideas, from the democratic majority, which is not yet in a sense swallowed by this extraordinary thought control.
Do courts help? I mean, justice is connected with the administration of justice. We're taking a second question, so you can, do courts help? What helps? How did it work out for Great Britain?
Courts not just help, but I think that one of the things that is keeping this massive risk from being a lot worse is that the independence of the judiciary system is proving to be a key part of defending freedom.
Are you talking about national institutions or about the European institutions?
European and in the United States as well. Institutions are working a lot better than we think, or that we might think. No? The other thing that I would say is, I remember in the early 80s that a professor friend of mine who's very left-wing said, I just don't understand how Thatcher won again when all my students agreed with me. And one thing that I would say is beware of believing in the power of trolls in social media. Because I have been, for example, the subject of numerous attacks from trolls, and many of you, and one of the things that you forget all the time is the silent majority. I have about 100,000 followers on Twitter and about 200 in another account, 200,000. And you tend to forget that you see 20, 30, 40, 50 people attacking you, but there's thousands that are simply agreeing with what you say. Don't forget that. We should never forget that. The reason why cultural Marxism never wins is because it's wrong. And it never wins in an election. It never wins in an election. It has to be sold as something different. It has to be sold as social democrat or something else, etc. All of the populist extreme left movements in Europe have tried to disguise themselves as accepting free markets, accepting the open economy, etc., etc. Therefore, we should know that we win first. And we already have won because we're right. And the second thing is we need to stop defending our ideas from the perspective of effectiveness. It makes absolutely no sense, because you say, oh, this measure that you've implemented doesn't work. They say, oh, it's because it wasn't true socialism. B, it's because it needs more intervention. No, we need to defend our ideas from the perspective of the moral position, because morally, they're right. And when you debate from the same principle, which is moral, it's over. And because everything else, they always have an excuse. They always have an excuse. They will always say, oh, it wasn't true socialism. Oh, that a case of interventionism, it needed more interventionism, etc., etc. So we need to remember that there is a larger majority than we think that is in that position. My children are at university today suffering that situation. Guess what? What do? They navigate. They're in the second year in, I'm not going to say, in 2 UK universities. They navigate the situation. Oh yeah, absolutely right. Yeah. Stalin was good. Okay, fair enough. Go. Next. Yeah? Which is what we did, by the way, when I was a kid.
Well, Daniel, let me ask you a question about your own area. I mean, I think I'm witnessing the disenfranchisement of the shareholder in your area, where major financial institutions are now essentially saying we are not going to follow our fiduciary duty to invest in the way that will get the best return for your pension fund. No. What we're going to do is we're going to look for those companies which are people would say that they are doing good in the world rather than making
Socially
good.
responsible.
Yeah. And socially responsible investing. The thing which Milton Friedman, I think, intellectually demolished 60 years ago. But that's happening.
Yeah.
And I see no way of stopping it. Doing so, not if we're, as liberals, we don't want the government to come in with a heavy hand. And that's one area, but there's also a lot of other areas.
Yeah, well, I remember when a lot of pension funds said that they were going to invest massive amounts of money on Argentine sovereign bonds because it was a way of supporting the economy. Yeah, then you lose immeasurable amounts of money when they default for the 8th time. So the point that I'm trying to make is that there is certainly a fashion. There is certainly a fashion in that regard. However, what is true as well is that what has changed in actually 6 years, less actually in the last 4 years, is that today, when you look at ESG and socially responsible investment, profit is the #1 driver. You don't buy in companies, loss-making companies, and you don't buy things that simply. So it's changing quite a bit, and in any case, reality ends up again coming back to bite you. I come back to the point with all my not respect, to be fairly honest. A country that defaults 8 times in so little time is, to the Argentine bond.
To move this question to Professor Legutko, I mean, first, yes, as John was saying, companies are being challenged. Chevron is being forced to act against its own interests. You said institutions work, and in the end, silent majority is present. So that's a good way to bring this question back to Professor Legutko. How are those institutions doing, you think, in the European Union courts? And also, we're in a country, the taxi driver who brought me from the airport was actually telling me about his government, so the silent majority didn't quite work out for Portugal. Spain, I don't mean to put a caricaturish spin on it, but I think socialists, communists, and separatists, is that fair?
Oh, it is, absolutely.
And then the courts, then the countries that enjoy Hungary, 11th year of conservative government, Poland, 6 years of conservative government, and I don't know, the last time I checked, what the institutions were doing were being hell-bent on lose the elections that kept being won by those silent majorities that in the end feel that a family sort of takes a female, a male, and then what those two of the species can produce for the future. So I would like to bring this justice question to Professor Legutko and then move on to the third question.
Well, I'm not sure about
institutions
justice.
Working great.
Yeah, but the EU, I think, represents all the ills of the modern society. It's not just an isolated case. So it means that a small step towards something better would be to loosen the relations, to reverse this federalist and centralist trend. I mean, the nation states have to be more sovereign. I mean, we're being attacked. I mean, Poland and Hungary, we're being attacked not for what we do, because we don't do anything worth condemning, that should be condemned. We're being attacked because what we are an alien body. We shouldn't exist. This is something that cannot be tolerated. I mean, a conservative government in the progressive European Union is, I said, cannot be tolerated. But my point is that the concept with which we are fascinated, infatuated, charmed, and stupefied is equality. All these things go on under the banner of equality. This is the obsession not only European, it's the Western obsession. Everything has to be equal. And that is, I would say something for which most of you will hate me, but there is an unholy alliance or a toxic marriage between equality and the concept of rights. And we are obsessed with the idea that everybody has to have rights. So it all starts with somebody saying that they have an identity, then they make a claim, and then the claim becomes a right, and it's being enshrined into law and in the political system. And that, first of all, it resembles a financial pyramid with so many rights as we have, and the number has been increasing over the last decades. We should be the freest people in the world, communities and individuals. How come, with so many rights and more to come, we are less and less free? That's the question that should be addressed. And the more rights you have, not only does it become unworkable, but you have the powerful institutions which distribute those rights. And they have to take away my freedom as a conservative, or Poland's freedom as a conservative, right? And give it to, those new groups, new political actors who claim new rights, right? So equality, egalitarianism is a vehicle of tyranny. And it has been described as a vehicle of tyranny for a long time. But somehow we, with our obsession with equality, we don't treat the dangers of equality seriously. And
this is actually a perfect segue, because my last question is about equality. And I was actually going to start with Daniel for you to answer first, and then if everybody could go through it. Yes, equality somehow is always about discrimination, not really about equality. But your book, Freedom or Equality, it makes me think of John Fonte's book, which shows a separate, shows a similar alternative, but it's about sovereignty or submission. Yours is freedom or equality. But what I wanted to ask about is, because those are elements that we're trying to bring together in this conference. Freedom, which is also free markets and free companies. One of the things you propose in your book is, I think you call it social capitalism, as an answer. You believe that markets and market solutions are the answer, and can get us out of the morass that we're in. And I think this is either a quote or close to a quote of what you write, that the public and society as a whole are nothing but consumers. And because of that, markets should be able to remedy various social problems that those consumers need solved. Now, at the same time, you use phrases such as there is love, a love of your life and your dedication. You talk about responsibility, you talk about compassion, you talk about free will. Those are not, this is not the language of commerce. They're not really phrases that we normally associate with market exchanges. And this is where I want to come, as I was saying in the beginning, that one of our problems is that capital underwrites everything, every problem that we're discussing here. Something pays for it. And I thought maybe a good way to, I would like to ask, is the market really the answer? And I would like to quote two people to get you started on it. Is it an answer to solve the problem of equality, which radical equality would mean that, well, I would have to gain some, lose some, have my head cut off when I'm with the shorter people, or grow longer legs when I'm around taller people, or they need to be chopped to pieces. So radical equality seems like a difficult proposition, as Professor Legutko was saying. But the father of really, or actually the articulator of modern conservatism, Edmund Burke, of whom I'm very fond, talked actually about something that resembles social capitalism, and that's in the debates over Hastings,
Yeah.
Who was not impeached in the end. But it was, of course, about the East India Company, which I think in power resembles the capital that we now have, funding various very woke enterprises like big tech. The East India Company, of course, in the end was brought down, and here's what Burke had to say about it, who was a big believer and defender, that it's the constitution of the company began in commerce and ended in empire. And no less than Adam Smith, the father of the invisible hand himself, referred to the strange absurdity of a company that had both the character of the sovereign and of the merchant. What do we do with the solutions that you propose, which is a free market solution, just free market solution, when we, I think arguably, are dealing with a situation where the companies are beginning to behave like sovereigns, and they live in the world that they perceive as post-national, as global. It is better for their product placement if we're all the same. They don't have to adjust to anything while paying lip service to race, to gender, to this, to that. If we all have the same culture, they can sell the same stuff to all of us. So this is my question.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Are markets an answer? How do we get out of it again?
Markets are the solution. And the reason why markets are the solution is we need to understand, first, the reason why I use the word social, family, all these things, is because I want to bring them back to the freedom defenders, because they have been taken, they have been sequestered by the people that actually don't defend freedom, family, or social matters. But the point that I wanted to make in the book is that the reason why markets are the solution is that we need to understand that you cannot have monopolies or oligopolies without a direct action from government, without a direct decision from government that either hinders competition or increases the power of a company above all others. In the particular case of these large multinationals that we're talking about now, one of them, I come back to my previous point, is free money. Many of these companies have not generated a profit for ages, but continue to grow on the basis of having access to trillions of dollars of liquidity and very low rates. So what we need to understand is that just by having normalized interest rates, a lot of these giants that we think are inexpugnable and impossible to defeat in their conquest of the world would simply vanish, would literally vanish. I always say to my students, who remembers Yahoo? Nobody. Why does nobody remember Yahoo? It still exists, by the way. It's a great company, but we don't remember it because it's been overtaken by another company. So what we need to understand is that the barriers to entry in that sector are so low that just normal functioning of markets would definitely eliminate those that that don't have a viable business concept, and would certainly keep the strength of the ones that do. But the reason why they keep that strength is not because they impose it. I buy a computer today, I don't have Google. It's even almost impossible to get Google on the computer. I have to do a number of things to put Google on the computer if it's from another company. You see what I mean? So the point that I wanted to make in the book is, when we discuss freedom and capitalism with students, and they complain about capitalism and the free market, what they usually are complaining about is not capitalism or free markets, but cronyism, as Professor Cole mentioned before. This is critical, because we need, and the key solution to our society is a market in which cronyism, which cannot exist without the direct decision of government, in which cronyism is limited to the max. Therefore, independent institutions, independent bodies, and an open market in which interest rates float freely and capital is allocated not according to the decisions of governments or central planners, but due to the decisions of consumers, is much better.
Maybe this is a place to take it to John. And how will it, what reason do markets have to defend nations, religious traditions, moral values?
Yes, I will try to deal with that, but I think Daniel is raising a question here and a problem and giving a solution to it too. Which is, of course, wider than capitalist institutions and is something that crosses all institutional life now. And what is it? Well, it is that many of these institutions have suffered, have been captured by interest groups, by producer groups in economics, and they are now run not in the benefit of the people who are supposed to benefit or society, but in the interests of political sects and other people. Now, we see this dramatically, of course, in England recently, in which institutions like the National Trust, designed to look after stately homes, and the British Library, and of course the BBC, all of these major, the Arts Council, I could run down the list, they're all under the control of what people who describe themselves as social justice warriors or woke or Black Lives Matter, and who, in a sense, completely distort the purpose of those institutions. Now, here's the problem, which is a particularly difficult one for people in this room, because when we look at what the independent institutions and cultural institutions are doing, our general view is that we do not want to use coercive state power directly to go in and change that. Of course, that's not what liberalism is about, it's not what conservatism is about. But if we don't do that, they are able, universities, for example, are able to use the argument of academic freedom indefinitely to perpetuate the absolute absence of academic freedom within their institutions. Now, this is an absurd paradox, and one that shouldn't be acceptable to us. But how do we deal with it? I think Daniel is rather fortunate here, insofar as he is able to propose a solution in the economic sphere. He can say, well, we don't give them subsidies, we don't give them tariffs, we don't intervene in all kinds of ways to prop them up, and furthermore, we don't run a monetary policy that keeps alive zombie companies indefinitely. And I agree with that, and it's a relief to me to find somewhere where we have a policy that is legitimate. But what do we do about all of the institutions of society which are now under the control of the enemies of society? Well, we can do some things. We can give tax benefits to encourage competition to them, but that's a long, long haul. I don't know the answer to the question, but I will give you one. And that's from a man called Vivek Ramaswamy, who's an Indian-American entrepreneur, has become quite well known recently. Many of you will know his name.
He will attend our conference.
Sorry?
He will attend our conference in Orlando, if I can shamelessly plug it.
Well, his argument, I heard him recently, we met at a conference recently. He said, I would like to propose the repeal and abolition of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, because that's the basis for a legal revolution which sustains all of this kind of activity. I don't believe I would have any success in making that proposal. So as a result, he comes up with two other proposals, which he doesn't like, by the way, but he thinks is a kind of second best solution. At least it does something. One of them is to add political orientation to the list of protected groups. So you can't fire people in the way that Richard described someone being fired from university. And indeed, you couldn't, in a sense, have a policy against hiring them. I don't like that solution. But on the other hand, it's better than the status quo. I think he has other ideas as well, but I'll just leave that. I've gone on too long. But this is a real problem for us. We really have to find a way of dealing with these things without the application of the kind of rules and power that we would object to in the hands of our opponents.
I would like to take that question to Professor Legutko, and also because uniquely, and Johnny would know it as well, in Eastern Europe, the BRIC was on the anti-sovereignty scale from the very beginning because of the way privatization was carried out. The enemies of sovereignty of the region, in the region, were the ones who ended up with most of the money, most of the resources to pull things their way. The European Union welcomes them, of course, more than anybody from the region. Notice that almost everybody in East Central Europe who was either in prison or whose parents were, and who is committed to independence of those countries. That's the opposition the European Union can't stand. Former communists have both the money and the popularity contest. So, but I would like to take the, what do we do? How do we use the markets
what do
for
we
the
do?
good?
Well,
Yeah.
I wish I could answer you, but well, I think my conviction is that we are living in a world of growing ideological monopoly, and the question that we have to ask is there anyone or any force, any institution that can stop, reverse, or subvert this monopoly? And then previously you asked about the courts. I didn't have time to answer. No, because the courts are not doing it. I mean, the courts are taking this egalitarian gospel, and instead of interpreting the law, applying the law, they create a new world, a new better world, right? More egalitarian. They take responsibility for the world of the future. That's why the courts have become one of the pillars of this orthodoxy. Now, the capitalist entrepreneurs, will they help? I'm sorry, but my answer is no. Will market help? No. Probably a part of the answer is my experience in the communist society. We, at a certain moment, we hoped that once we open the economy, there will be a thousand flowers will blossom, right? And no, of course we became richer, the economy is doing well, but it's not an answer to this question of this stifling ideological monopoly, this awful progressivism which kills our minds and our institutions. Why? I think because the entrepreneurs have usually kind of assimilated themselves to the situation. They are not non-conformists. They are not. The capitalists are not the rebels. They are people who make money, which is fine from their point of view, also from our point of view. But certainly, they usually accept the current ideology, especially if this ideology is enforced with such intensity as today. The capitalists were exemplary National Socialists in Germany. I think they would have been exemplary Stalinists if there had been capitalism in the Soviet Union, and now they are exemplary progressives. And to expect that the market would somehow reverse the trend and will help us to infuse the society with new alternative ideas, no way. Once the change is done, they will join us. But as long as the left has the monopoly, don't dream of that being a subversive force. So who will make the difference? We will.
But I think that what you just said is absolutely right? Is that you cannot expect society to change if you don't get involved. How did they get to those institutions? How did the people that go against society get in those institutions and crowd them? By getting involved. What we cannot do is, as I hear all the time from followers and people that read me, they say, oh, you know, there's no solution, so I'm going to do nothing. Yeah, to do something. One cannot expect, if you have a business in, I don't know, in Hungary, in Poland, in Spain, in Portugal, whatever, you cannot expect the businessman to go out and fight the power. Huh? This is not Public Enemy. Huh? This is not, you know, a rap artist. This is somebody that tries to survive and create jobs, etc. That person needs to have people that once they've achieved a certain level of success, or you know, we mentioned this at breakfast this morning, participate in society. You don't get into the BBC or into the National Library out of thin air just because you defend one thing. It's a process. And you mentioned before, they're very united. Unite.
This is a great, since we are out of time, this is a great place to end. I think, yes, let's infiltrate the institutions, let's unite, and let's face the fact that the culture war is upon us, and we have to have courage, we have to defend language, and we have to defend virtue that our civilization was built on, and we'll be in fine shape. Absolutely. So, anyway, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Bardzo dziękuję, panie profesorze. So nice to